My first memory of the space program was in 1967. Now, I was about 6 years old at the time, so I mean, obviously, just sort of snatches of, fact here and there, as I went along and did my thing. But it wasn't about rockets, and it wasn't about spacesuits, and it wasn't about space helmets or anything like that. It was actually the expression on the faces of my mother and my father, because they were intently watching something on television, and at the age of 6, I was intently watching them. And what it was a funeral with 3 caskets: Grissom, Chaffee, and White. The Apollo 1 fire, for those of you who don't remember, was a launch pad test, basically, of the first test flight of the Apollo command module and service module that would carry the astronauts to and from the moon. And it was supposed to be routine. I mean, the 3 astronauts climbed in there, they sealed the hatch, and then the fire occurred. And one of the more poignant interviews that I ever had, it was many, many years later, was talking to one of the engineers who worked on that flight. And ordinarily, I mean, you've heard of the explosive bolts that'll just, make a hatch fly off if there's a problem. That kind of caused some problems for Gus Grissom after his first Mercury flight, because after it splashed down, the hatch flew off, and there was all the controversy about whether or not he did anything. Well, Grissom was also aboard Apollo 1, obviously. And this engineer just, really just went ashen as he described to me how the explosive bolts for that particular hatch were lined up on a workbench waiting to be installed prior to that test. So, now I'm sure all of you are wondering, is this whole talk going to be a downer? Here we are talking about, the space program, and all of a sudden he's up there talking about funerals and whatnot. Well, okay, all right. Not all memories associated with the space program are bad ones. Who remembers, for example, I Dream of Jeannie? Okay, some of the younger folks here may remember the soap opera Dallas. Well, the guy that played J.R. Ewing, who was the real big meanie in that one, in an earlier role, it was actor Larry Hagman, and he played Anthony Nelson, who was an astronaut whose spacecraft during re-entry went awry, and it landed on a desert island, and he found a bottle, and he opened the bottle, and out jumps Barbara Eden, who at the time incurred the ire of network censors because she had the audacity to wear a costume that exposed her belly button on national television. My goodness gracious, what was she thinking? But the people of Cocoa Beach remember I Dream of Jeannie, because that's where this fictitious program was set. In fact, if you watch the show enough, you go to TV Land or Retro TV and watch enough, you'll actually hear them say something like, hey, let's go to dinner over at Bernard's Surf. Bernard's Surf not only still exists, it's just known as The Surf now. But if you go there, and there's also a bar they run that's associated with it, they've got original sketches by cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, who was on Apollo Soyuz. And he and all those guys would go there all the time to eat at The Surf, and he was an artist, and he did sketches on the side, and some of those are framed, hanging up there right now. How big a deal is I Dream of Jeannie for Cocoa Beach? Well, if you go to Cocoa Beach right now, you will find I Dream of Jeannie Lane. Now, it's one of those, roads to nowhere that kind of leads to Laurie Wilson Park, which kind of leads out onto the ocean, so it really isn't much of a road, but they do have I Dream of Jeannie Lane there. Who remembers Gilligan's Island? Okay, one of the well-worn episodes there, they had a couple of cosmonauts who landed in a spacecraft that looked suspiciously like an American Gemini ship, but that's okay, whatever. And they landed on the island, and they matched wits with the skipper and the professor and all that. And not the greatest photo in the world, but there's Tina Louise as Ginger talking to one of the cosmonauts there. Well, obviously for kids my age, Apollo was big stuff. I mean, like, if my folks went off to the grocery store, for example, and did not get the jar of Tang that had the little lunar rover on the side, covered in shrink wrap, I mean, heaven only help them there, because back in those days, we were really part of what was, I coined the phrase, the Tang dynasty, because it was really a huge deal. Now, being an Air Force kid, getting back to Eglin, we were at Elmendorf up in Alaska when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. It was in 1971 that we moved down to Florida, and that's when all of a sudden there were 2 really huge names that were making their impact on Florida. One, obviously, was Apollo. Anal retentive spacophiles love this particular shot, because this is a Buzz Aldrin on the surface of the moon. And if you ask anybody at NASA, they will admit sheepishly to you that there are no still photographs of Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon. No photographic evidence that he really was there. Now there's some film, but no actual pictures because he held onto the camera. So every picture that you see, whether it's an astronaut coming down the ladder or walking around on the moon or looking stoic like that, it's buzz. Except when you bring in the anal... Now, are you raising your hand because you're gonna tell me where the picture of Neil is, right?
No. I just want to mention that was the time photograph of the century.
There we go, the time photograph of the century, very true. But what makes it a big deal to spacophiles is that when you say there are no still photographs of Neil Armstrong, they'll say, look in Buzz's faceplate. That little human figure back there is Neil Armstrong. So technically there is one shot of Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon. So you've got the two names that are making a big deal in Florida in 1971, about the time that my family arrived here. One is Apollo, and the other one is I'm trying to just, you know, it's on the tip of my tongue here. It's like that. Oh yeah, okay, fine. And in the theme of the talk here today, you know, Florida then and now, it's kind of interesting to remember that both Apollo and Mickey Mouse and Friends, even though they're based out of Florida, Florida was not the first choice for where they were going to go. Because back in the day, they were talking about launch sites in California for Apollo to go to the moon, in Texas to go to the moon, in Georgia, believe it or not, where they've got the Kings Bay sub base, they were talking about possibly sending it there, and then also the Bahamas. Now the big deal for that was that anytime you launch a rocket and it's going to go into an equatorial orbit around the Earth, because the way the Earth rotates, you have to go from west to east. So if you were to launch, say, from California and go in an easterly path, when you drop your boosters, you're dropping them on places like Las Vegas or El Paso, which, you know, obviously would not endear you to the neighbors there. So it's much better to drop them in the ocean, hence the Kennedy Space Center's location for NASA's launch site. Equally, Disney, believe it or not, was thinking of locations like Niagara Falls or St. Louis for their famous theme park before they wound up here. So even though we tend to think of space and Disney as Florida's birthright, actually that's not necessarily the case there. So anyway, enough of that stuff. Let's go into the book here. I do radio for a living, as you've heard, and you might, you know, be wondering about the transition from writing for the ear as opposed to writing in print. Now, obviously, I was flattered when the University Press of Florida asked me to write, you know, my first book about space, and I kind of sat down with my acquisitions editor and said, look, you know, I've done this for like 20 years. I can pretty much write anything that you'd like. What do you think is going to sell? What do you think is going to be popular? And he said, well, how about something on the history of the shuttle program? And I'm like, hey, good idea, fantastic. Well, about that time, NASA was getting ready to make a transition going from this, which is the very familiar space shuttle coming in for a landing. In fact, folks will ask me, what part of a shuttle mission do I like the most? Is it the excitement of the launch, or is it the landing? And frankly, I prefer the landings. Because when the space shuttle blasts off, and you hear the astronauts very courageously say, go a throttle up, everything's fine, Houston, they're sitting there with their hands in their laps, like it or not. They can take control if there's an emergency, but ordinarily the shuttle at that point flies itself. During this part, about 2 minutes prior to landing, you've actually got a human being with their hand on the stick. And the shuttle is coming down 6 times steeper than a passenger jet at 200 knots, and there's no engine power, so they can't circle the runway and watch the in-flight movie or anything. They got to come down in one piece or several. So this is kind of crunch time for the astronauts. So it's the human element on that really kind of impresses me the most. Also, there are certain wags among the press. You know, when you're covering the landing, you're out of this grassy field. And every once in a while, I've heard stories about people like, you know, reporters who will get into a group of other folks who have never been to a landing before, and like 10, 20, 30 minutes before the shuttle comes down, they would do something like this, just to get everybody to look in the direction of what's going on, and obviously they didn't get anything going on. But anyway, with the shuttle program going from this to something more like this, that's what I told my editor that we should at least include in the book, because within about a year, the very familiar space shuttle is going to be on its last legs. It's going to go away in favor of something called the Orion space capsule, which I don't know if you all heard the test flight the other day of what was known as the Ares 1X. If you remember what the shuttle looks like, you know, with the 2 boosters on either side, you take one of those boosters and put a capsule with people on top of it, and that's pretty much what the Orion capsule will look like on liftoff, but NASA's never done that before. That's why they had the Ares 1X test flight. And as someone within the agency told reporters, you know, a good test flight will not help you, but a bad test flight will kill you. So the fact that the Ares 1X actually did launch and did pretty well, there were a couple of dents in the boosters, but you know, nothing horrendously serious. No, that was actually pretty good news for NASA. But anyway, what I wanted to do was you know, talk about the transition from the shuttle to Orion. And one thing that people ask me an awful lot is, okay, fine, everybody's talking about the shuttle ending right around like maybe 2010, maybe late 2010, early 2011, but is that really going to be the end of the shuttle program? And I have to tell them, well, a qualified maybe, because NASA's already talking about the possibility, maybe, of adding on an additional flight, one of which would be in search of antimatter. Who watches Star Trek? Okay. The stuff that makes the USS Enterprise go, obviously, is antimatter, but scientists say there really actually is antimatter out there, and they developed this device called the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer. There's your $10 word for the day, and that's going to be carried up on one of the final shuttle missions to the International Space Station to look for actual antimatter out in the universe. So NASA's got about 6 missions left to go, limited by the number of fuel tanks they've got. Because if you've seen the shuttle on the launch pad, you've got the shuttle upright, and it's against the butterscotch-colored external fuel tank with the 2 boosters. Well, the shuttle comes back. The boosters fall in the ocean, but the tank burns up. So every time you launch a shuttle, you got to have a tank. And NASA is limited by the number of tanks they've got for the number of flights they can do, because they just closed the factory that builds the tanks, and they fired most of the people that build the tanks. So they're kind of stuck in terms of the number of flights they can do before the shuttle program actually comes to a halt. So that's pretty much where we're going on that. So wanted to go back to the very beginning of the Orion program with the book. And believe it or not, that all started, the transition from the shuttle to the new capsule started, I'm not kidding, it was a space exploration conference, NASA's very first one, back in 2005, that took place, and I'm not kidding, at Walt Disney World's Contemporary Resort Hotel, not very far away from the Magic Kingdom. So you've got engineers there, and NASA gathered them together and said, all right, listen, what we want you to do is go off and design a new kind of spaceship for us, and it can have wings, it can have boosters, it can fly back, it can plop like a capsule, it can do whatever, but you guys just basically go off and throw whatever you want to at the wall and see if it sticks. And if once you decide on what would work, then we may build it. Now, I had a friend one time who worked as an editor at Marvel Comics. And those are the people who do, like, you know, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and all that. And he would regularly go to cocktail parties where he would have 2 friends, each with a drink, and they would have these discussions kind of like, okay, if the Incredible Hulk got into a fight with the Thing from the Fantastic Four, could he take him? You take that and you apply that to rocket scientists, and that's what was going on here at Walt Disney World. So that's where the book basically begins. Now, anytime you say, okay, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to start off with engineers, everybody's going to like, oh, is this thing going to be wonky? Is it going to be too techy so that nobody can understand it? Well, when I think of engineers, I think of Sam Bedingfield. Sam Bedingfield was a fellow that started off flying jets for the Air Force over at Edwards Air Force Base in California. And he later became an engineer for NASA, and then later became the very first Apollo engineer to get a phone call from Houston saying, well, it's 1969, Neil Armstrong's about to walk on the moon, and they say, well, we're coming up with a new kind of a ship, we want you to work on it, but we don't exactly know what to call it yet, but it's going to be some kind of space shuttle. And so Bedingfield's story begins back right around like 1959, and this is from chapter 2. Back in 1959, before NASA and Project Apollo, Bedingfield left the Air Force to pursue farming on land owned by his father in North Carolina. There was only one catch. After 3 days, says Bedingfield, I figured out I didn't give a damn about farming. With a wife and a family to provide for, he went back to the only thing that he knew, and that was aviation. Bedingfield's search for a job led him north to Langley Field in Virginia. The people in the employment office said they didn't have any aviation jobs available, but the news really wasn't all that bad. They said there was a new outfit called NASA on the other side of the runway, and they needed people, so why not try there? Bedingfield got in his car, drove around the runway, went into the NASA office, and behind a desk sat Gus Grissom, his closest friend back during his days in Edwards Air Force Base. Well, what are you doing here, the fledgling astronaut asked him. Bedingfield said he was looking for a job, but Langley didn't have any. Well, we got jobs here, Grissom said. Bedingfield admitted he didn't know the first thing about flying rockets. Well, that's okay, Grissom responded. Neither does NASA. So when I think about engineers, that's kind of where I go. Oh, by the way, anybody who knows me well knows that I love trivia, and here we go. We were talking earlier about how the NASA Space Exploration Conference was at the Contemporary Resort Hotel in Walt Disney World. That's where the little monorail train's going to zip through on the way to the Magic Kingdom and such. Well, it was John F. Kennedy who challenged the nation to go to the moon. But it was Richard Nixon who welcomed the astronauts of Apollo 11 back to Earth. And it was Richard Nixon, after that flight, in the Contemporary Resort Hotel about 1972 or so, where he first coined the phrase before a group of newspaper editors, "I am not a crook." I love stuff like that. So anyway, anytime you cover a story extensively, and I've covered 101 space shuttle missions, you got to start somewhere. And for me, that very first shuttle flight was back in 1986, and it was Challenger. Because back then, in 1986, January, there was virtually no network coverage at all of what was going on with the space shuttle. They launch, they land, they launch, they land. It's like sending a reporter to Orlando International Airport and saying, "Flight 238 from Duluth just landed, back to you, Bob." I mean, nobody's going to care about this, and nobody covered anything. In fact, when my book first came out, one of the first book tours that my wife and I went to was up in Atlanta. It was for a conference of independent booksellers. And one of the things that you do when you're in Atlanta, you go to the Coca-Cola Museum, because that's where they make Coke. So you walk in there, and one of the first things you see there is the Coke dispenser that they created for use aboard the space shuttle. It would dispense soft drinks in a weightless environment. So back in '85, Coke was getting ready to send this up, and then all of a sudden the Pepsi people heard about that. And they're kind of like, "Well, we're not going to get left out of this, for heaven's sake." So they came up with a Pepsi dispenser that went on the same mission. So there's astronaut Story Musgrave on live network television trying to describe which warm, flat soft drink he liked the best. And at that time, that was about the only time there was ever any network coverage of what went on during the space shuttle, except 11:38 a.m. on January 28, 1986. I don't even know what story I was covering that day, but it was not about the shuttle. So I was in a production room, which is where you take your sound and you cut it up and you make it into a story that people hear on the radio. And one of my colleagues goes whizzing past really, really fast, and it's like nobody at the station moves that fast, for heaven's sakes. And I stick my head out, and I say, "What's going on?" And this person responded, "The shuttle just blew up." To which I'm like, "Yeah, right." I just go back to what I'm doing for about 1/10 of a second. And then I figured, well, they're recording mission audio in the next production room. Perhaps I should at least have a look as to what's going on. So I just round the corner, go into the next room, and there is the largest group of pasty-faced people that I'd ever seen in my life. So without really thinking about it, I grabbed a recorder, the set of keys to the news car was his old Toyota Tercel. I thought the wheels were going to go flying off, this poor thing. And then headed down Highway 50 following the mushroom cloud out to the Kennedy Space Center to begin to cover the mission. So we had a two-way radio back then, kind of like, C.W. McCall, breaker, breaker, good buddy. And so I'm yelling into this thing as I'm driving along, "Get me through security, get me through security," giving them my social security number over an open radio channel, which you got to remember, this was 1986. Now we worry about identity theft, but, back then it was a simpler time. But when I got to the Cape, my badge had been approved, and they were printing it up, and I had a few minutes to kill, so I was kind of hanging around outside the security booth, and I looked off to the side, and I saw a school bus sitting there. It was from Citrus County, Florida. And in front of it were a group of these 10-year-old third graders with these hangdog expressions on their faces because they had seen it. And those were the very, very first interviews that I did regarding the Challenger explosion of 1986. And I kind of held on to that tape because I figured, somewhere down the road, you put it in a glass box in case of emergency, break glass, that sort of thing. It's going to come in handy. And that is when I decided to start writing Chapter 5 for Final Countdown, which was about Challenger. Now, back then, the teacher who was with them, I still had her name, and bless her heart, she was still teaching in Citrus County, so I called her up and said, "Hey, look, I'm trying to track these kids down. It's been 20 years. So, I mean, if it was a little girl and they grew up, got married, changed their name, how are you going to find them? So you work on it from your end, I'll work on it from my end, and we'll see what happens." So, no soap at all. Until a point where we were putting up the Christmas tree at the house, and my cell phone goes off, And I'm kind of like, hello? He's like, is this Pat Duggins? And I'm like, yeah, who's this? Oh, this is Jenny Eschen. You talked to me 20 years ago about Challenger. To which I'm like, clunk. She was married with a husband and a dog doing a banking job over in Atlanta and was able to track her down. So talked to her, her teacher, and this is what came of that in Chapter 5. While the astronauts waited through the final minutes of the countdown, the kids from Citrus County were having a great time waiting for the liftoff of Challenger. It was a great time for a while anyway. I saw the boosters go off in two directions, said 10-year-old Robbie Sampson after the accident. You knew there was a problem, especially when there was that big cloud of smoke. It was really bright, and then you could see the boosters go off in two directions, said 10-year-old Jennifer Golden. You could tell there was a problem. 9-year-old Jenny Eschen had this observation. I was expecting a safe flight because I thought it was exciting to have a teacher in space. You know, it's funny that in the years following Challenger, Jenny had thought almost nothing about that day at the Kennedy Space Center. Because like for kids nowadays, their big news moment is probably going to be 9/11. I mean, everybody remembers where they were and what they were doing when the two planes hit. For their parents or grandparents, it might have been the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Everybody remembers that. I was 2 years old, remember going to see the Eternal Flame at Arlington. Always thought it was a funny location for a fire, but you know, I was just 2 at the time, so that's the way that worked. But for kids in 1986, Challenger was the big deal. They got to remember that in '86, this was before cell phones. So all these kids get back onto their school bus, and they start the 3-hour trip back home, and there was no way for the bus driver to get a hold of the moms and the dads to let them know the kids were all right. So there's the moms and the dads back over in Citrus County watching this footage of Challenger blow up again and again and again and again on network television, not knowing whether a piece of a booster had hit their kid or not. So as soon as the bus trundles in, it's like 6 p.m. at night. And that's when the kids said they were really scared because the moms and the dads were just all over them like a cheap suit, and they were just scared to death of the reaction. So that's the way that kind of went for them that day. Oddly enough, this is a shot of some of the wreckage coming off of the recovery boat following following Challenger. But that, in turn, prepared me for Columbia in 2003. Now, what you're seeing right here is the windshield from the spacecraft that had been collected from one of the debris fields in Houston, Texas, or east of Texas. And they had put it all on flatbed trucks and they brought it back in. And when we were taken in to see all of this stuff, it was a group of about like 10 reporters. And whenever there was a launch, you know, years ago, you'd hear the name Mike Leinbach used a lot out there. He was the launch director at Kennedy Space Center. He'd say bon voyage to the astronauts and see them on their way, and he'd control the liftoff. Well, in 2003, NASA put him in charge of collecting all of the debris from the disaster when the shuttle burned up during re-entry, and to study it and try to figure out exactly what happened. So we're out there walking around. Now, everybody recalls now that when Columbia took off, a piece of foam fell off of its external tank, hit one of the wings, broke a heat shield, and that's why the shuttle burned up. The day they took us out to see this wreckage, they didn't know that, at least not at the moment. So Mike Leinbach's walking around with us and saying, no news today, nothing going on, you know, it's just, you know, whatever, just, you know, look at what we've got, and if you have any questions, then just, you know, let me know and we'll answer it for you. So we're walking around and we come to this. What happened was the foam had hit the leading edge of the shuttle's left-hand wing. And what they had done was they had taken all of the gray heat shields that lined the edge of the wing and created this plastic framework, and they put all of these pieces of the shield back where it was supposed to belong to form the leading edge of the wing so they could study it. So it really doesn't do you much justice here, but if you look right about there, Mike Leinbach was pointing at that point, and he said, oh, by the way, you see that spot right there? And I'm there with him, and he's like, yeah, I see it. He said, well, that's the point where we think that a piece of foam came off of the external fuel tank, hit the shuttle, and caused the accident that destroyed the vehicle and killed the astronauts. And I'm kind of like, that's the first time I've ever heard that. When did you guys come up with that? And he looks at his watch and he says, oh, about an hour ago. So I'm like, would you excuse me for just 1 minute? Anything like that? I beg your pardon. Out comes the cell phone, and we get that on the air pretty quickly. But the one thing that you really see a lot, covering the shuttle for 20 years plus as I did, was the real enthusiasm that the people of NASA had for what they did. I mean, they really lived it, breathed it, slept it, ate it, drank it. And probably one of the best stories I've got that illustrates that was back during the days of, this gentleman back here in the sweater was talking about the Atlas rockets. Back during that day, they were having a problem with water backing up in the fluid lines, the fuel lines rather, and that kept the rocket from operating properly. And NASA's like, well, you know, there's no way that we could possibly make that work, so we got to figure out something. So they got all of the engineers together, and they got all of their contractors together, and they said, okay, why don't we just come up with a chemical formula that you pump into the fuel lines, and that'll make the water go away, and it'll make the engines work. And NASA's like, okay, well, that's a pretty good idea, so why don't you go off and do that? So what they called it was a water dispersion formula, and they just put the first one together, and they pumped it in the fuel lines, and it didn't work. And so they went back to the drawing board, and they came up with a second, and that didn't work. And a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth. They're up to the 39th chemical combination, and they can't get it to work. And they're kind of like, okay, fine, why don't we just try it one last time, and if it works, fine. If not, okay, well, whatever. And they put together the 40th water dispersion formula, and it worked. The rockets functioned, everything went fine, but you may have actually bumped into this chemical combination at some point because they thought water dispersion was kind of a long name, so they shortened it to WD. I don't know how many of you have fixed a stuck doorknob or a squeaky hinge with WD-40 out there, and I'm not suggesting that we send human beings to the surface of Mars to fix little problems like that, but when you're taking care of problems, you just never know what's going to come along. So we wrap up Final Countdown by basically taking a look at what's going on with the possibility of sending human beings to the surface of Mars. Nobody's been there, but some scientists who created the rover that you see there vicariously have been to the surface of Mars. So I talked to Steve Squire about it. And during press conferences for the Mars rovers, he was always great because, like, you know, the engineers being engineers, and there's nothing wrong with that. You ask them a question, they say, well, we went up and we did this and this and this and like that. And Steve Squires was always good for a sound bite. It's like, you know, we walked up to that rock and threw everything at the tool bag at it. He was always great for a cut. So I asked him basically, if I was on the surface of Mars, you know, what would it be like? If you were on the surface of Mars, what it would be like? And he just went into this really great description about, you know, how it's like. Some parts of it, you'd sink in the sand like you're in the Sahara. Other parts of it, you'd be walking on small rocks like you're in Antarctica. But obviously, you would be needing, like, you know, spacesuits and things to convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. So whatever we wind up doing, I mean, there's a report out there from the White House that may send us back to the moon, might send us off to send astronauts to asteroids, maybe going off to Mars. Obviously, a lot of different challenges that NASA's going to have to face there, but that's where the book wraps up. So once the manuscript for this thing was done, on the back of it, these are called blurbs. And you send them off to people who know something about your industry or your subject. And you say, look, you know, read it through, and if you want to contribute a blurb to go on the back of the book jacket, that'd be just great. And one of the folks that I sent one to is Craig Kvault. He's with Aviation Week and Space Technology, just really, really well known in the industry, very smart at what he does. And his attention immediately went to the chapter on when the shuttle first docked with Mir. Because I interviewed the commander of that mission. It was a fellow by the name of Hoot Gibson. And when I interviewed Hoot, it was just before the docking mission, so we talked about all the challenges they were going to face and such. And then after that, he started becoming a little bit more forthcoming about one of his earlier missions, one that happened to be classified. So anyway, I'm just sort of listening and taping and listening and taping, and I figured, you know, one of these days, it's almost like the interview with the kids during Challenger. You hang on to that, because one of these days it's going to come in handy. So when I'm writing the chapter about Mir, okay, I put in all the stuff that, you know, who talked about the flight, and then for the heck of it, I tossed in the thing about the classified mission, just to see what people would think. And so Craig Kvault writes back, actually he emailed back within about a day or so, and he had these emphatic, you know, like that, who told you what about a secret Defense Department mission? I'm like, yeah, I've got the tape, I've got the notes, everything's fine, don't worry about it. For, you know, anybody who's ex-military here, Gibson did not talk about the secret payload, he didn't even give it the name of what it was. He just simply talked about something that happened, you know, during the flight. So I wrote Greg back about that, and he was happy with it, so everything's cool. And he wrote my blurb, and everything's fine there, so that's pretty much where that particular, you know, episode ended. Oh, who told me about the flight? All right. Well, I know we're being taped, but it's a small group, so everybody. All right. You see, what Hoot Gibson told me about his secret Defense Department flight. Oh, just go get a copy of the book. He does it so much better. I mean, for me to sit here and try and describe it, I mean, you know, it's like, so to borrow from Rod Serling, submitted for your consideration, the story of lost dreams, new hopes, and the ongoing conquest of space, final countdown, NASA and the end of the space shuttle program. Thank you all so very much for taking time out of your day to come here. And I think we've got, do we have time for questions at all? Now, since we don't have a microphone, I'm going to repeat the question. Now, if I forget to repeat the question, somebody yell at me, because we need to make sure our television audience gets that. A gentleman was referring to the enthusiasm that, you know, that comes out from, you know, the WD-40 story, that sort of thing, and how we've lost it these days. It's interesting because I don't know if you had a chance to read the report that was put together by President Obama. Put together a blue ribbon panel called the Augustine Commission, and it's their job to help chart NASA's future course. Now, the one thing that kind of struck me about this is that for a long time, NASA was always criticized for not doing enough to let everybody know what it is that they did. Now, the Augustine Commission, I think, really took that to heart, because they put together a graph that basically says, well, what it did was it incorporates PR into what goes on. So in other words, if you go to the moon, this is how you sell it to the public. If you go to Mars, this is how you sell it to the public. If you go to asteroids, this is how you sell it to the public. Actually, they want to go to Mars, but they're leaning toward going to the asteroids, because you can send people to an asteroid faster than if you go straight to Mars. You go straight to Mars, you got to develop all of this technology and stuff, and everybody's sitting around, okay, waiting for it to happen. But if you make the faster trip, it generates more buzz, or that's their contention. So they really, at least there's some people out there that are working to try and recapture that enthusiasm. Next question at all? Gentleman over here. It's a question about the LRO L-Cross, which is it's a spacecraft that was designed to hit a crater to try and basically kick up ice that may have formed in the bottom of the crater. Now, they were expecting a plume of debris that people could actually see on Earth with telescopes. Didn't quite work out that way. Now, they swear they actually did get some debris. And so what happened was, when the first impact was the booster rocket, which hit, then the other spacecraft, as it was going into its own dive bomb, would go through the cloud and sniff it and look at it. Then it would crash. Then there was a third spacecraft out there that would watch the second spacecraft crash and all that stuff. So they say there's information out there. It's all preliminary. They have not released it as of yet. You know, it's still kind of out there. Gentleman at the back. Gentleman, you know, mentioned, you know, he started off, you know, working with an ox in the field, and all of a sudden he was working, you know, in the control center of Project Gemini, which is pretty neat. If you look at it, and somebody actually mentioned this to me, and even for me, and I've done this for a while to kind of like, you know, sort of put in context for me, that a lot of the 12-year-olds who were watching Apollo were people like Steve Jobs. In other words, the folks that would put together either like, you know, Apple or Microsoft, and they grew up in the midst of all that, and all of a sudden, well, we see what came out of that. So, but there are also detractors out there that say that the space shuttle and NASA is a tremendous waste of money too. I mean, they're not everybody out there likes the idea of spending like $100 billion or plus on the International Space Station, only to perhaps burn it up maybe in the year 2015 or 2020. And really, they say, well, has anything come out of that? And there are a lot of critics out there. So NASA's somewhat liked by some, and they're not really liked a whole lot by others. Gentleman here. Gentleman wanted to know about the Augustine Commission, man versus unmanned. That's always the balancing act, because there are a lot of people. I mean, even James Gibbons, who was Bill Clinton's science advisor, I quote him in the book, and even he had to admit, you know, really you can get a lot of science done with robots, as opposed to sending, you know, human beings there. But he did also make the very obvious point that Congress, which funds all of these projects, is a people business. And so it's better for them to be standing there getting a photo op with an astronaut who just came back from a triumphant trip to space, as opposed to this machine that they're going to go off and, you know, and sniff, you know, Mars or something like that. So also, it's the one thing that the Augustine Commission did was it's all about balance, because they don't have enough money to do everything, whether it's manned, unmanned, or anything like that. They want to keep the shuttle program going. Well, where's the money going to come for that? They want to keep the International Space Station program. Where's the money going to come for that? They want to build Orion. You got to pay for that too. And right now, NASA's they estimate about $3 billion per year short of what they need in order to be able to do anything that NASA is being asked to do. So I think the big message from the Augustine Commission, in terms of manned or unmanned, is for the White House to fish or cut bait. In other words, they have to come up with the money, or scale back their expectations and deal with the disappointments, or just go ahead and kill NASA altogether. It was just about one of the most blunt statements on the space program that I've heard in a long time. And, you know, for Alabama, that's where they're building and testing the Orion capsule and the Ares rocket. So Augustine said, well, Ares is not necessarily the best rocket to do what NASA has to do, so maybe you ought to scrap it. So Alabama's mad. They also say the shuttle program should end on schedule next year, which means Florida's going to lose 7,000 jobs instantly. So Florida's mad. They didn't give political cover to the White House because they said, look, you're going to have to make the tough decisions. We're not going to do that. So obviously, I'm sure the White House is not all that happy with it. So we'll just have to see. There's no decision expected until next year, which is about the time the shuttle's going to go away. So it's the next few months are going to be kind of interesting. And I think we may have time for one last question here. Back to the gentleman there. But what we're talking about is Gus Grissom's Mercury capsule that sank after he landed after his first suborbital hop to the Bahamas. And for a long time, everybody blamed him for firing the explosive bolts, making the hatch fly off, and his capsule sank. And he swore it didn't happen that way. Sam Bedingfield, that I interviewed for the book on engineers, was one of Gus's best friends, and he, for the longest time, said, you know, it didn't happen that way. Sam's theory, and I don't know if this was borne out by the results of that test or not, was that if you look at most spacecraft, there's a way for people on the outside to open the hatch to get somebody injured out. In other words, it's almost like it says, like, you know, rescue, pull here, there's a T-stick. Well, there was one on the Mercury capsule, and Sam Bedingfield's theory was that there's a tile that covers the handle that when somebody has to get rescued, you take the tile off, you pull the T-stick, and the hatch pops off. His theory was that the capsule was bobbing around in the ocean so much, it's possible that that tile came off, and then some of the lanyards, some of the rope from the parachutes got wrapped around the T-stick. That pulled the lever, and that fired the charges. So I don't know if that was borne out by any of the evidence, but that was another of the theories going into to what might have happened there. But there are a lot of people yes, a lot of people no on that. Anyway, I think we're just about out of time here. But again, I just wanted to thank everybody very, very much for coming on out. Quick one from the gentleman in the back. All right, Norman Augustine, head of the. He was well. I only know him as a former president of Lockheed Martin. It's Norman Augustine. Also was serving out here at Eglin Air Force Base. And on that, I don't know of a better possible way to end the program. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Very, very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Food for Thought concludes with a portion of the remarks made by NASA Administrator Michael Griffin in a presentation entitled, What the Hubble Space Telescope Teaches Us About Ourselves. It was recorded at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition in downtown Pensacola in July of 2008.
It's often remarked on that one of my characteristics is a certain candor. That's the nice phrase. Bluntness is the other phrase. And it's remarked on as if I had a choice. I don't really know how to do any differently, so I hope I will be interesting tonight and that candor will not go over the line to bluntness, but I'll do my best. So I do want to I want to begin by thanking Ken for inviting me to be here tonight. This institute is a truly unique group. It tackles interdisciplinary issues of science and engineering that help to extend mankind's reach on many frontiers, including ours. The IHMC does a lot of work for NASA. And in fact, we at NASA deal with issues surrounding man-machine interfaces literally every day. Whether it's flying the International Space Station with a crew of 3 astronauts on board, trying to control and operate what is today a 3/4 million pound space station, and when it's done, it will be a 1 million pound space station. Or controlling more than 50 Earth and space science missions that are operating today in space, or developing new flight control algorithms and avionics for future aircraft, or building the next generation of space vehicles that we're working on today that will take Americans and our partners back to the moon, and then later on go even deeper into our solar system, to Mars. To carry out our mission, we have to understand the conditions that our machines will face and how they will behave under those conditions. Because mission success, and indeed the lives of our astronauts, depend upon our machines and the technical acumen of the scientists and engineers who develop and operate them. I thought it was appropriate to speak tonight about the Hubble Space Telescope for a bit. one of the greatest machines that NASA or anyone else has ever built, and about our relationship with that machine and what it has taught us and taught me about our universe, and more importantly, ourselves. Now, this coming October, astronauts on board Space Shuttle Atlantis will rendezvous with Hubble to repair it and upgrade it for the 5th time in its nearly 2 decades of service. I think you all know that. It's hard to read a paper without knowing that we are going to do that. It was somewhat controversial at NASA when I came on board, and I settled that controversy. Now, when they leave, it'll be better than ever. It will be better, in fact, than anyone ever imagined that it might be. Back when I was working on the Hubble project 25 years ago, we never imagined that it would be what it is today or what it is going to be after this 5th servicing mission. And the story of this scientific and engineering marvel is one of bold vision and imagination and absolutely audacious risk-taking. But it's also a story of perseverance and ingenuity when, as sometimes happens, the risks that you take are not always successfully negotiated. It is a story that transcends science, with Hubble images on display today in art museums or in homes where no scientist lives. But we all know that the images are far more than just a bunch of pretty pictures. Hubble has observed the birth and death of stars not unlike our own solar system. It has shown the collision of the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 with the planet Jupiter, not unlike the asteroid collision 65 million years ago that wiped out the dinosaurs, which then roamed the Earth. It has peered through a tiny knothole in the night sky, deep into the early universe, finding thousands of galaxies where our own eyes would only see a patch of darkness. It has found that the galaxies in our universe are accelerating away from each other at a rate faster than any astrophysicist, including Edwin Hubble, ever predicted, allowing new insights into the birth and eventual fate of our universe while raising new mysteries about dark matter and dark energy, constituents of a universe that, in all humility, astrophysicists today must admit that we barely understand. Hubble has become a cultural icon, while at the same time remaining an instrument of fundamental scientific discovery. It is unique in human history in its ability to occupy a place of prominence in both art museums and scientific journals. The birth of the Hubble Space Telescope and its launch in April 1990 would not have caused anyone to envision this outcome. Indeed, Hubble's first images were unaccountably blurry. An analysis of its optical system revealed that a 2.3 micron error had been introduced in the grinding of its 2.4 meter primary mirror. Now, the width of an average human hair is about 80 microns. So the error was almost unimaginably small. But as many of you in this audience will understand because of your own professional backgrounds, it's a huge error in terms of the optical wavelengths that a telescope must manipulate if it is to function at all. So this mistake was devastating to the astronomical community. It was equally devastating to NASA's credibility. NASA was the brunt of jokes on late-night talk shows, with the Hubble being compared to the Titanic, the Hindenburg, and the Edsel. I see that most of you are old enough, as I am, to remember the Edsel. Now, I've said, I remarked once in a previous speech that we in the space business live by a creed of excellence or die without it. And that has happened. And with the Hubble, we faced a situation where this small error left unchecked called into question our ability to live by that creed. The jokes were cruel, leveling charges that NASA no longer had the right stuff, in Tom Wolfe's elegant and memorable phrase. While such talk unfairly denigrates the many dedicated engineers and scientists and technicians who work late into the night to maintain the high standard of almost all our endeavors, even the slightest error on such a highly visible project calls into question what happened, and above all else, who was to blame. So as an aside for a moment, maybe this Institute of Human Cognition, Human and Machine Cognition, should study this especially human trait, the tendency to kick those who are down. For me, it always calls to mind President Theodore Roosevelt's great speech, Citizenship in a Republic. You should Google it, with its famous excerpt about the man in the arena. Few of those offering criticism of the Hubble mistake were capable of understanding its nature or origin, or indeed anything else of how the Hubble was designed, or of the exacting tolerances to which it had to be built, or of the trade-offs that engineers face when deciding how to allocate scarce resources to multiple competing concerns. As someone who has served on numerous failure boards and has had to lead teams out of despair, I can only say that criticism from those who are both inept and uninvolved serves no useful function. Maybe that was blunt. It cannot even make us feel worse about ourselves than we already do when we have failed. But it does seem to be a constant companion of bold endeavors. It is the dark side of human progress. A long career in the space business with way too many opportunities to observe this behavior has caused me to come to the belief that there is, or at least should be, such a thing as earning the right to hold an opinion. But I digress. In the aftermath of the Hubble debacle, some Washington policymakers called for an end to NASA altogether. But we don't cast aside human frailty when we venture into space. And wiser heads understood that reaching for the unknown requires the fortitude to deal with adversity. As President John Kennedy warned the Congress and our nation in May of 1961, when, with 15 minutes of human spaceflight to our credit, he set forth the challenge to go to the moon, and said, if we are to go only halfway, or reduce our sights in the face of difficulty, in my judgment, it would be better not to go at all. So the Hubble scientists and engineers set their sights on fixing the telescope. The first step was to characterize precisely the observed error in the primary mirror, and then craft a corrective lens for the aberration. The crew of the first servicing mission to Hubble trained intensively for one of the most complex shuttle missions ever undertaken, involving 5 spacewalks and over 100 specialized tools to correct the optics, while also installing new solar arrays, gyroscopes, and other electrical components. They also upgraded the telescope with a new wide-field planetary camera. Now, you all know today that this first shuttle mission to service the Hubble, as well as the 3 which followed, were huge successes. So today, the Hubble dazzles us with the splendor of our universe. But during those grim years between 1990 and 93, this awe-inspiring success was far from certain. If you didn't know the core strength of the NASA team when the chips are down, you might have bet against us, and you would have lost. And that is why, to me, the most meaningful lesson from the Hubble Space Telescope has more to do with our human nature than with the other secrets of the universe. That is, in the face of adversity, we must resolve to persevere. To that end, I know, because I see it every day, that NASA still has the right stuff. So I think I should take a moment to acknowledge those who have and who will risk their lives to make the Hubble Space Telescope such a success. Every astronaut I know who has been on a Hubble mission, and many who haven't, has a special place in his or her heart for that machine. They believe it to be a part of something greater than themselves, something that for which the risk of their lives is worth the promise of unlocking the secrets of our universe for future generations. Dave Lacrone, the Hubble program senior scientist and a former co-worker of mine, once said, "We are privileged to be the first generation of Homo sapiens to gain a clear and deep view of the visible universe. And what we see out there is staggering in its beauty, awesome in its scale, and shocking in the way that it has upended our preconceived notions about how nature works. You don't have to be a scientist to grasp it. Any thinking person who has come in contact with Hubble images and Hubble discoveries seems to find exhilaration in the notion that our place in the grand scheme of things is now better defined than in all prior human history." Dave is so right. And yet his comment makes a great preface to an observation I now want to make. It might set you back a bit. Science is not everything we do at NASA, nor should it be. And while the advancement of science is of fundamental importance at NASA, and scientific discovery has a key role in human spaceflight, it is not the most compelling reason to do it. I'd like to take a little time to explain why I believe this to be so, because numerous critics have called into question the cost and risk of journeys into space to the Moon, Mars, the near-Earth asteroids, or the construction of the International Space Station, which we're using as a tool to learn how to sustain such journeys. So let me try and provide some food for thought for you tonight. Some of you will disagree with me, and thus spark maybe a worthwhile debate. I never learn anything by talking to people who agree with me. To me, NASA's manned missions to the Hubble Space Telescope are qualitatively different from other human spaceflight endeavors. The difference is fundamental and it's important. While our other efforts may not seem today to be as noble or worthwhile as servicing the Hubble, they are in the long run more important to the future of the human race. I'd like to try and explain why I believe this is so. To survive off-planet in a different environment, having different natural resources than those we have come to understand and take for granted, without the ability to drive to the nearest supermarket or doctor's office, is a qualitatively different experience than a brief foray into low Earth orbit. Not many realize it, but NASA and our international partners, 15 other nations, have maintained a permanent human foothold in space on board the International Space Station since October of 2000. The hard lessons of living and working in outer space 24/7, 365 are much different than those of an intense 2-week campaign to service a scientific instrument like the Hubble, or to deploy a mission to Jupiter like Galileo, or the Compton Gamma Ray Observatory, or to conduct other research, as has been done on many individual shuttle missions. So when we begin our halting steps back to the Moon in the next decade, or a journey to Mars in 20 or 25 years, we will need to know what we must bring with us, but also how we might live off the land with the resources available to us when we arrive. And after we test the hypothesis that we can survive on other worlds, we then need to determine whether such outposts can become economically viable, meaning is there anything to do there which is worth the investment to do it? Now, many today will assert, without benefit of proof, that the answer is, of course, yes, while others believe that the answer is, of course, no. In my own opinion, no one today can know the answer. The answer can be found only by experiment. So in that sense, the purpose of today's human spaceflight program is to conduct such experiments, to explore and develop options, and to unveil possibilities for future generations. Now, this experiment will be conducted in space over the course of the coming centuries by people from Earth. Only the language, culture, and motives of the experimenters remain to be determined. I hope that this experiment will always find Americans, in company with our international partners and allies, as first among equals on the frontier of their time. The experiment will not be dissimilar to those conducted by our ancestors far removed in space and time, when they left East Africa looking for an easier existence somewhere else. It will not be dissimilar to that conducted by our more immediate ancestors just a few centuries ago, when they began to explore and settle what to Europeans was the New World. In that context, I might note that it required the long-term investment of kingdoms, governments, commercial industry, and private citizens for many generations before I think it could honestly be said that the New World provided a positive return on investment for society at large. On a smaller scale, our experiments in space will not be dissimilar to that conducted by Thomas Jefferson when he risked impeachment to consummate the Louisiana Purchase and then sought congressional financing, marvelous chutzpah, for what became the Lewis and Clark expedition 200 years ago. And by the way, Lewis and Clark overran their budget, lost a considerable amount of their equipment, fell so far behind schedule that they were given up for dead, and failed to achieve their primary goal, which was to find a suitable water route from the headwaters of the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. Now, does anybody here think that their effort was wasted? Venturing into space is similarly an experiment, but one eminently worth conducting for several reasons. First, I strongly believe that there will be near-term benefits to science, technology, economics, and national security, as we begin to incorporate the solar system into our sphere of influence, as science advisor Jack Marburger framed the issue a few years ago in a speech that I particularly liked. Now, I don't believe I need to dwell for this audience upon the benefits to human society of scientific advances. I'll say a few words. We were on the verge of developing a new paradigm, a new view of how the universe is constructed. The last time, a century ago, that such an experience was forced upon us was accomplished through the work of Albert Einstein and his elucidation of relativity and quantum mechanics. Today, these disciplines underpin much of modern technology, and they form the backdrop of physics against which new ideas are interpreted. What will be the implications of forming new theories to embrace the experimental finding that 96% of the mass energy of our universe is comprised of dark energy and dark matter, things we don't even pretend to understand? Everything you can see and feel around you is 4% of what exists. And until a few years ago, we didn't know anything about the other 96%. Regarding technology, what is the benefit to a society which learns how to do what no one else has ever done? No human activity is more demanding across a broader range of disciplines than space exploration, nor is there any which produces greater returns from its mastery. 2 generations and more ago, in what I consider to be the best speech he ever gave, President Kennedy said, quote, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills." And he went on. Now, as a nation, we are still reaping the benefits of the Apollo investment, but they're coming to an end. America is no longer supreme in the world marketplace, not even in aerospace. It is time to move the goalposts, to define some new hard things, and to move outward again for precisely the reasons President Kennedy articulated so long ago. I also believe that a vigorous civil space program offers collateral benefits to national security. When I've spoken of this in the past, it has usually elicited some amount of surprise. But I think those who are surprised take too narrow a view of national security. For the last century, the United States has been a world power, even if at times we didn't aspire to it or even recognize it. And as such, we have assumed certain responsibilities for leadership on the world stage. In that capacity, it is inevitable that we have been and will again be called upon to make decisions and take actions that displease other nations and societies. We can't please everyone, and we can't retire from world affairs. So if that's true, it is equally true that we cannot prosper if every hand is against us. If we must do hard things, it behooves us also to undertake activities which easily attract allies and partners, things which bind others to us in the world community. And no activity has shown itself to be of greater inherent interest and excitement to others than the exploration and development of the space frontier. And so I ask, concerning national security, what is the value of being a nation, a society, which leads the world in an endeavor which excites all others, one in which every nation that can do so seeks to partner with us?